Good morning, everyone. Welcome. I'm Dr. Brad Roberts. I'm director of the Center for Global Security Research, and it's my pleasure to welcome you today to a talk on Chinese reactions to the U.S. nuclear posture review and missile defense reviews, and the implications of these reviews for the U.S.-China nuclear relationship. And it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Tong Zhao for opening remarks on this subject. Before turning to Tong Zhao, let me make a few introductory remarks. And of course, we in the laboratory community have taken a strong interest in the nuclear posture review. It has important implications for our line of work. It's read closely by people around the world. One of the challenges of leading a posture review, as I did a dozen years ago, was understanding that we were writing, whatever we were writing was being read by every interested stakeholder from many different perspectives and many different capitals with many different agendas. And clearly, China's response to the ideas contained in the Biden administration's strategic policy reviews and posture reviews is a critical factor in the emerging security environment. The administration has tried to set out the right markers to motivate the relationship in a positive new direction, but it's also made some decisions and some commitments that are not supported by China. And we're both wary of the unfolding competition in the strategic military domain between our two countries. And thus it's interesting and timely for us to have the benefit of a Chinese expert view on China's reactions to the reviews and its sense of where we should be headed in trying to manage and reduce nuclear risks. And for that purpose, I'm very grateful to be able to welcome Dr. Tong Zhao today. Thank you for joining us again. This is not his first appearance as a speaker under our auspices. And he is also a regular participant in CGSR workshops, and we look forward to welcoming him back in person, or welcoming him in person one of these days. Our speaker is a visiting research scholar at the Program on Science and Global Security at Princeton University. This is a new and temporary position he holds. He continues to hold his senior fellowship at the Nuclear Policy Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, was for a long time affiliated with its office in Beijing. His research focuses on strategic security issues, including nuclear weapons policy, arms control, nonproliferation, missile defense, hypersonic weapons, and China's security and foreign policy. He is the author of Tides of Change, China's Nuclear Ballistic Missile Submarines, and Strategic Stability. He is also the author of Narrowing the U.S. China Gap on Missile Defense, How to Help Forestall a Nuclear Arms Race. These are both fine pieces of work, and I commend them to anyone who's interested in these topics. Tong Zhao has a bachelor's degree in physics from Tsinghua University in Beijing. Tsinghua, for those who don't know it, is generally referred to as China's MIT. He also holds a master's in international relations from Tsinghua University, and he holds a doctorate in science, technology, and international affairs from the Georgia Institute of Technology. Tong Zhao, thank you so much for making the time to do this with us today. Thank you for your intellectual leadership on these questions. I'll turn it over to you for about 45 minutes of remarks. Then I will turn to the audience for Q&A. If you'd like to join the conversation, please raise your hand electronically to do so. But if you'd prefer to send me a message in the chat function, I'll do my best to ensure that it comes into discussion before we run out of time. Tong Zhao, over to you. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Brad. It's a great honor to be here and to chat about American, the Biden administration's nuclear posture review, missile defense review, and the Chinese reading of them. it's a great pleasure to be able to speak to this very distinguished group. I think it's fair to say that with the U.S.-China strategic competition growth, the Chinese system becomes increasingly even more secretive. Greater efforts are made to better protect not only government decisions on these issues, but also the process of internal deliberation. So that means it is increasingly harder and harder to accurately evaluate the official thinking of the Chinese government on these issues. We may have to increasingly rely on Chinese experts' analysis and evaluations to understand the thinking within China. I do believe, based on my reading of Chinese analysis and reactions, I do believe there are many important misunderstandings or overreadings in China about this nuclear policy review and missile defense review, and about American nuclear and missile defense policy in general. So in my presentation, I will try to highlight those misunderstandings or inaccurate misunderstandings in China, and try to offer my personal thoughts on how to address them. As we know that U.S. and China held a working level meeting on the recent U.S. DoD 2020 annual report on Chinese military capabilities. Perhaps there is a need for the two sides to also have similar working level meetings on the posture review report, on the missile defense report, simply to for the U.S. to better explain its policy and to address potential Chinese misunderstandings. And in this regard, I will also try to offer my personal thoughts on how the American side could better clarify its policy to the Chinese audience in future official or track 2 level conversations. In general, it is safe to say that the Chinese reaction to the Biden administration's nuclear posture review and missile defense review, but mostly the nuclear posture review, is very negative. I think this is partly due to the overall emphasis by the Biden administration on strategic competition with China. President Biden made it very clear that we are living in a decisive decade. So Chinese experts think that this is the overarching American objective, which is to outcompete China within the next decade, and they tend to interpret all American policies, nuclear, missile defense, or other defense policies under this broad theme of U.S. trying to outcompete China, trying to contain China, and the U.S. embracing a strategic hostility against China at the highest level. So that's understanding of American strategic intent very much influences how China reads specific American nuclear and missile defense policies. The fact that within the nuclear posture review, the U.S. Talks about China before it talks about Russia. In other words, the U.S. places China in front of Russia when talking about contemporary threats to the United States. despite the fact that Russia still possesses a much larger nuclear arsenal than China, I think reinforces the Chinese conviction that the nuclear policy, missile defense policy, they are now very much driven by this overall strategic intent to contain China and outcompete and even defeat China in the foreseeable future. Chinese experts understood that the President Biden personally, is willing to consider more cooperative security measures, including arms control. He's personally interested in sole purpose of nuclear weapons or even no first use policy. But the fact that President Biden's personal preferences were not really reflected in the official posture reviews indicate to China that the American system as a whole, that including Democrats on the left and Republicans on the right, there is a very strong internal consensus within the U.S. Policy Committee to contain China. So that strong internal consensus was able to override President Biden's personal preferences. That makes it's an indicator to China that the U.S. government as a whole is fully in the camp of containing China and confronting China. The most optimistic read I encountered believed that the Biden administration is torn between its efforts, its idealistic wish for promoting cooperative security and even arms control, and the more realistic goal of facilitating great power competition with China. But the more commonly heard view and the more pessimistic view in China is that the Biden administration is only using its positive narratives, talking about strategic stability, talking about arms control, etc., as a disguise of its real intent to pursue great power competition. So the overall reading from the Chinese side is very negative. One important issue is whether the U.S. is increasing the role of nuclear weapons in its national security strategy or reducing the role of nuclear weapons. And in this regard, the NPR tries to send the signal that the U.S. seeks to reduce the salience of nuclear weapons. It talks about the fundamental role of nuclear weapons as to deter nuclear attack, and the U.S. would only consider use of nuclear weapons in extreme circumstances to defend the vital interests of the U.S. and its allies and partners. However, the effort to highlight this point in the NPR doesn't really work to convince the Chinese. The mainstream Chinese reading is the Biden administration actually tries to increase and raise the role of nuclear weapons. One thing they cited, they refer to as an example is the very ambiguous terms of fundamental role and extreme circumstances and vital interests. They think those general terms leave enough room for the U.S. to actually adopt a very assertive nuclear posture against China. So perhaps one way to help better clarify the American message and intent is, to offer to discuss the terms of extreme circumstances and vital interests. And, it doesn't have to be a one-way discussion of American vital interests and American understanding of extreme circumstances. It can be a two-way conversation that both sides discuss their understanding of their respective extreme circumstances and vital interests. The NPR mentions that it removes the option of hedging against an uncertain future as a formal role of nuclear weapons. This is supposed to signal that I think the US is not increasing the role of nuclear weapons. But again, the meaning of this specific phrasing, of this specific language is not very clear to Chinese readers. So it may be useful for the US to try to elaborate more on what it means to take off the table the option of hedging against an uncertain future as the formal role of nuclear weapons. A key conclusion, a key observation that China drew from the nuclear posture review is the US is embarked on the road to fighting limited nuclear wars. And this is again contrary to the official language within the NPR, which says the American goal is to extend the record of non-use and reduce the risk of nuclear war. And the US wants to maintain a very high bar for nuclear employment. So why this reassuring message failed to persuade the Chinese analysts? I think China experts basically offered three major concerns. One is about the term of integrated deterrence, which is again a key concept in this review. But the Chinese reading of the American adoption of integrated deterrence is that the US wants to further blur the line between nuclear weapons and non-nuclear weapons. And the US wants to maintain a lower threshold to use nuclear weapons to deter cross-domain threats like in the conventional space or cyber domains. So the question is this a balanced reading, an accurate reading of the meaning of integrated deterrence? Is this mostly about making nuclear weapons more usable against non-nuclear weapons threats? Certainly, I understand that the US has an interest to making sure its enemies understand that the US keeps the option open to using nuclear weapons in response to strategic non-nuclear attack. But I think the US can do more to clarify the entire and comprehensive meaning of the new term and the new strategy, and actually try to reassure that the US is not trying to making it easier to use nuclear weapons against a non-nuclear attack in order to avoid enemies, or countries like China to overinterpret the term of integrated deterrence. The second Chinese concern is, again, is very much about the perception in China that US is deliberately lowering the threshold of nuclear use. And they cite evidence of US continuing to deploy low-yield nuclear weapons. One example is about the W76-2 low-yield SLBM warhead. Chinese experts argue that low-yield tactical warheads like this make the US more able to conduct flexible military offenses. So the big problem here is, the American emphasis on low-yield nuclear weapons started with the Trump administration. At that time, the US was worried about Russia's so-called escalate to de-escalate strategy. And the US thinking was if US could have a capability to respond in kind to a limited Russian nuclear threat, that would deter Russia from launching a limited nuclear attack in the first place. But Chinese experts in general do not recognize the linkage between the American renewed interest in tactical nuclear weapons and Russia's so-called escalate to de-escalate nuclear posture. So they tend to attribute it entirely to American deliberate effort to develop nuclear warfighting and to lowering the threshold of nuclear use. And the third Chinese concern is really about the so-called tailored deterrent against China. There is this section in NPR that talks about developing a tailored deterrence posture against China. And in particular, in the NPR, the US for the first time mentioned that a wide range of tactical nuclear weapons are now playing a role against China, and those include the W-76-2 low-yield SLBM warhead, the globally deployed bombers, dual-capable fighter aircraft, and air-launched cruise missiles. This is the first time the US specifically mentioned that these tactical nuclear weapons have a role to play against China. So the question is, why does the US have to specify these? Because it really increases Chinese threat perception. It doesn't really seem to help. Perhaps my personal reading is the US really believes that there is a growing risk of Chinese nuclear first use, which I wouldn't rule out. It might be possible that under extreme scenarios of a very ugly conventional war, when China is losing and when the stakes are too high, China might consider first nuclear use or threat of first nuclear use. But I think given China's growing conventional military advantage near its own border, especially within the first island chain in the Asia-Pacific theater, China is more comfortable about its own conventional capability, and China has less incentive to consider nuclear first use. Rather, China is more concerned about the US becoming more serious in thinking about using nuclear weapons first in a limited manner because of US declining conventional military superiority in this region. So I think this American stress on the importance to deter Chinese limited nuclear first use appears to miss the larger Chinese consideration. And by specifying these tactical nuclear capabilities against China, it only increases Chinese concern that the US is more actively thinking about limited nuclear first use. And of course, the specification of these tactical nuclear capabilities in the China scenario also undercuts the previous American claim that its renewed interest in tactical nuclear weapons is mostly about Russia. So today it's, suddenly says, in fact, yes, it is also about China. So that basically, makes China feel vindicated of its concern that this is all about China in the first place. It's all about, American interest in nuclear warfighting in the first place. So it doesn't really seem to help. The consequence of this increasing Chinese belief that the US is becoming more interested in limited nuclear war is that it could make China become more interested in developing its own escalation management capability. Traditionally, China seems to rely on massive retaliation to deter a massive nuclear attack for decades. But I think, in recent years, especially when there is a growing and more realistic risk of a U.S.-China conflict over Taiwan, China becomes more worried that the U.S. may be more interested in thinking about limited nuclear first use, and therefore China feels a stronger need for itself to have a capability to respond in kind. So that type of thinking, I think, will lead to China investing more resources to develop crisis management capabilities at different rounds of the nuclear escalation ladder. And that's a direction that we really don't want to see the two countries moving into. Because when you have two countries now both pursuing escalation management capabilities, it will be much harder than before to reach agreements on nuclear stability. It's much harder to contain an open-ended nuclear competition. So the problem today is China worries the US is more interested in limited nuclear first use, whereas the US is worried about China threatening nuclear first use and obtaining coercive leverage from doing so, just like what Russia has been doing over Ukraine through the issuance of implicit nuclear threats. So I think given this circumstance, what we can do to help mitigate this development is to be more willing to discuss no first use. This is not to defend the Chinese position about no first use, but I do genuinely believe that the US could be less afraid about discussing no first use with China, because there are many issues that a discussion of no first use. There are many issues related to no first use that China itself hasn't thought through, and there are many difficult answers that China needs to provide when it comes to no first use. One of the things is China clearly is not going to trust American no first use, even if the US adopts no first use. So how to make no first use commitment credible is a common challenge facing both countries. So that's something both sides can talk about. And the Chinese policy of no first use also doesn't include a promise not to threaten a nuclear first use in a conventional war. It only includes a promise not to actually use nuclear weapons first. So the US and China can also talk about a more useful no first use policy, which includes no first use and no threat of first use of nuclear weapons in a conventional conflict. I think that type of conversation may help mitigate the challenge the two countries face today. Of course, when we talk about no threat of first use of nuclear weapons, it will open up an entire debate about what constitutes a nuclear threat. The Ukraine war, the Russian nuclear saber rattling during the Ukraine war proves that it's hard to define what constitutes a nuclear threat. But if the US is willing to discuss no first use, it would at least show American goodwill to have a more substantive discussion with China on the nuclear topic. It could perhaps also help China better understand American concerns about the credibility of Chinese no first use policy. So I think it could be mutually beneficial. Another, of course, major common important theme in the NPR is the need for the U.S. to deter two major nuclear powers. The NPR basically says by the 2030s, the U.S. will, for the first time in its history, face two major nuclear powers as strategic competitors and potential adversaries. But when the U.S. talks about deterring two major nuclear powers, there are two very different scenarios. One scenario is there is a very substantive and deliberate Chinese-Russian joint nuclear war planning, or at least joint nuclear coordination. But there is also another scenario, the second scenario, which is there is no, deep Chinese-Russian nuclear joint planning or coordination, but China might, make an opportunistic move during a Russian-American military crisis in order to take advantage of the existing crisis. And in that scenario, the US may also need to address the potential nuclear component of that opportunistic Chinese move. However, these two scenarios are very different, and it may be useful to distinguish them from each other because their implications for American nuclear capability and posture is very different. In the second scenario, for example, if China is only making an opportunistic move to take advantage of an ongoing US-Russian conflict, China wouldn't have a strong incentive to escalate its own move into a full confrontation with the United States. That would, make the US-China conflict a more important development than the previous US-Russian conflict. That wouldn't be in Chinese interests. So in the second scenario, I think China is unlikely to, make relevant its strategic nuclear weapons. So maybe only American theater-range nuclear capabilities would be relevant and necessary to deal with this more limited scenario of Chinese opportunistic move. But in the first scenario, I think that's a more serious scenario. If Russia and China will have deep joint nuclear planning and nuclear coordination, it's in that scenario that the US may need to think about a stronger overall nuclear capability and a very different nuclear posture than today to deal with this combined threat. But even in this scenario, there is a lot of uncertainty about the possible degree of future Chinese-Russian nuclear coordination. Given the bilateral distrust between China and Russia, are they really likely to be able to engage in substantive joint nuclear planning or coordination? So there is still a lot of uncertainty about the degree of the cooperation. And therefore, it might be better for the US to point out that the extent to which the US needs to deal with two simultaneously, to deal with two nuclear rivals simultaneously depends on the level and type of Russian-Chinese nuclear cooperation. If the US makes that linkage clearer and makes the American preparation for dealing with two nuclear rivals simultaneously conditional on the level and type of Chinese-Russian future nuclear cooperation, it may better discourage future Russian-Chinese nuclear cooperation. Another very important point to Chinese experts in the NPR is nuclear sharing. there appears growing Chinese worry that the U.S. Under the guise of strengthening its extended deterrence to its allies, is going to explore and pursue options of nuclear sharing, especially with its Asia-Pacific allies, and to adopt the NATO type of nuclear sharing to the Asia-Pacific region. And the AUKUS cooperation also raises some concern in China that the U.S. is deliberately proliferating nuclear weapon materials and technologies to non-nuclear security allies. But when it comes to China's concern about U.S. nuclear sharing, it is not very clear what's the substantive Chinese concerns. Is China worried about the nuclear implications of American nuclear sharing? For example, will nuclear sharing make the U.S. More likely to consider limited nuclear warfare at the regional level? Or is the Chinese concern more about how nuclear sharing might enhance U.S.-led alliance network in the region in general, and how it might embolden military activities of U.S. allies in this region, and how it might generally affect regional stability, etc. It's unclear what's the specific Chinese concern about nuclear sharing. So perhaps it may be useful for the U.S. and China to explore conversation to better understand each other's threat perception. Through such threat perception discussions, it may also help China better think through its own interests and its own concerns. Because much of the current Chinese policy discussion is really happening in an internal echo chamber. Everyone is repeating everyone else's criticism against American nuclear policy. So a U.S.-China conversation might help China have a more structured internal deliberation about the real Chinese interests and the real Chinese concerns it has, and a clearer Chinese thinking about its own interests, I think is better than a more ambiguous Chinese thinking about its own interests for the purpose of better managing the bilateral nuclear relationship. Another useful fact, perhaps for people to understand, is China genuinely doesn't appreciate American allies' security concerns. They genuinely don't think U.S. allies need a more robust nuclear umbrella from the United States, because they don't really face real security threats. So because China dismisses the security concerns of the U.S. allies, it turns to interpret the nuclear sharing and strengthening extended deterrence through the lenses of geopolitical motivation. It tends to believe that it is all about U.S. wanting to better contain China, and nuclear is just a tool to achieve this goal. So I think the U.S. and its allies shouldn't assume that China fully understands the security concerns of the U.S. allies for the purpose of strengthening extended deterrence, because China really doesn't. An overall observation is that this posture review appears to focus a lot on trying to understand China's military rationale behind its nuclear buildup. Whether China is going to consider limited nuclear first use, whether China is going to make more nuclear coercion going forward. There is discussion about the military rationale of Chinese nuclear thinking, especially behind the recent nuclear buildup. But I tend to believe that the recent Chinese nuclear buildup is more driven by a political mandate from the top political leadership, rather than driven by a clear military rationale. I don't have time to go into this, but I think it might be useful for the US policy community to have a more comprehensive understanding about the drivers behind the apparent shifting in Chinese nuclear thinking. And in this regard, the NPR emphasizes the importance of enhancing strategic stability with China. That is certainly very good. But it looks like China is increasingly less interested in discussing a narrow definition of strategic stability that is focused on nuclear weapon issues. China wants to discuss a broader strategic stability that includes the overall bilateral relationship. And China wants to use this broader discussion to press the United States to address China's more pressing political level concerns that would directly threaten China's regime security and political security. So perhaps the US can also be more open to discuss a broader strategic stability framework in order to more effectively reduce Chinese motivation to build up its nuclear forces. One specific issue relates to long-term warning. The NPR emphasizes, to its credit, that the US does not rely on launch under attack policy to ensure a credible response. And rather, the US is prepared to withstand an initial attack. And also, the NPR clarifies that the US doesn't have an hair trigger alert policy. That's very good reassurance. But the overall situation today is China is becoming more interested in long-term warning capability or even posture. China's silo-based ICBMs under construction are likely to be merged after their actual deployment. If China itself shifts towards a more reliance on strategic early warning and launch under attack or launch-on warning type of posture, China will need time to develop the necessary experience to learn about the vulnerabilities and risks of false alarm, etc. So it will become a more dangerous period as China increases its interest in launch under attack or launch on warning. So perhaps the US could more seriously consider joint measures with China to reduce both countries' reliance on launch on warning capability or a launch on warning posture. The Chinese previous official talking point is very much against launch on warning posture. So that could provide some useful opportunity for the two sides to make this topic for future discussion, at least at bilateral meetings or through P5 meetings. The US can share its own experiences of dangers with regard to launch on warning posture, with regard to false alarms, all the ways that technologies and humans can make mistake, basically to so-called educate the newcomers as China's own operational policy regarding launch on warning and strategic early warning is still being formulated at this moment. Now let's let me briefly make two general observations about the missile defense review, which is much shorter than the previous version in 2019. One issue is how to address the increasing entanglement between Chinese and North Korean nuclear capabilities. The missile defense review says the U.S. will continue to stay ahead of North Korean missile threats to the U.S. homeland through a comprehensive missile defeat approach. That's a continuation of previous American policy, but as North Korea, massively increases its nuclear forces, according to Kim Jong-un, most recently, North Korea is going to exponentially increase its nuclear arsenal in 2023. North Korea may have a much larger ICBM force going forward. And because of the geographical proximity between North Korea and China, North Korean ICBMs launched towards American homeland would follow similar trajectories as many Chinese ICBMs launched from many Chinese ICBM bases towards the U.S. homeland. In other words, American homeland missile defense system that can defend against a North Korean ICBM attack might inevitably have some capability against Chinese nuclear retaliation capability. So how to address that growing entanglement between the Chinese and North Korean capabilities simply because of their geopolitical proximity is a growing challenge for the U.S. to reassure China about its homeland missile defense. Here, if it is increasingly difficult for the U.S. to distinguish its homeland missile defense at the technical capability level against DPRK from those against China, then at least maybe the U.S. could try to making a greater effort to clarify American strategic intent when it comes to Chinese retaliation capability. Again, I tend to believe that U.S. and Chinese experts could start a joint expert study to look at if there are technical measures through which the U.S. would make its homeland missile defense only effective against North Korean ICBMs without seriously threatening Chinese ICBMs. In other words, is it technically possible to make U.S. homeland missile defense safer to China's strategic deterrent? If the two countries' experts can jointly work on this issue, whatever answer they may get from such joint study, that work will in itself help reassure China and help China better understand the objective technical challenges the U.S. faces in reassuring China about its homeland missile defense. So it would be in American interest to promote and sponsor that type of joint expert analysis. And with this type of efforts, the U.S. argument that China really needs to help contain the growth of North Korean nuclear capabilities. Otherwise, the U.S. would just have to continue building up its missile defense. That type of argument would hold more water, would resonate more with our Chinese audience. A second point about the missile defense review is that how do we deal with this line between regional and homeland missile defense? Because this current missile defense review maintains a distinction between regional and strategic missile defenses. At the regional level, the U.S. will try to address missile threats from any country of any type but at the strategic level, the U.S. will continue to rely on strategic nuclear forces to try to deter large intercontinental range nuclear missile threats from Russia and China. However, a new development is as the Taiwan contingency becomes more realistic, a future nuclear conflict between U.S. and China is likely to start at the regional level. And China used to almost exclusively rely on its strategic deterrent as the backbone of its nuclear deterrent against the United States. But now the Chinese military is increasingly interested in acquiring the capability of conducting limited nuclear retaliation at the regional level in response to a similarly limited American nuclear first use. So this open-ended and unlimited approach to develop and deploy regional missile defenses would have an increasing impact on Chinese capability to conduct effective limited nuclear retaliation in the future. So China, I think, would increasingly worry about such impact, and it will make the two countries' nuclear competition more intense at the regional level, which is not a main concern for the two countries in the previous decades. And the Missile Defense Review also points out that the American adversaries are increasingly pursuing long-range space and missile systems, which increasingly blurs the line between regional and homeland defenses. And it is increasingly clear that the U.S. will develop a long-range cruise missile defense and hypersonic missile defense capabilities, especially against future long-range conventional missile threats from Russia and China. Here, I think perhaps the U.S. can more explicitly highlight the linkage between such long-range missile defense and Russian and Chinese long-range conventional missile development. In other words, if the U.S. makes its development of long-range cruise missile defense and long-range hypersonic missile defense more conditional on Russian and Chinese future development of long-range conventional missile capabilities, it might better dissuade Russia and China from developing such long-range conventional threats to American homeland. And I still think there remains some room to prevent an arms race among the major powers in the area of massive conventional homeland attack capabilities. So that's one measure U.S. can consider to explore this opportunity. It is certainly a positive development that the Missile Defense Review does not mention that the U.S. accepts no limits to American missile defenses. That's, I think from the Chinese perspective, a positive development compared with previous reviews, but it is still unclear what exactly may be open for bilateral discussion. So it may be useful for U.S. to clarify, or to provide examples of specific areas that the two countries can actually discuss. And this is useful because we need to understand that China itself is also embarking on a very ambitious program to develop its own multiple layered missile defense capabilities. So I think that Chinese development, the Chinese ambition, the Chinese interest in missile defense is going to provide an increasingly level playground for a more equal bilateral discussion on the issue of missile defense. and therefore the U.S. should be less afraid to talk about missile defense and can think more about potential opportunities this Chinese capability and Chinese interest may offer in the future. I've been talking for a long time, so I should perhaps stop here and open up for comments and questions. Thank you so much.